All right. Well, good evening, everyone. We continue our, character study theme. I was, they gave us a list of characters that we could choose from to teach about. And I got that email really early, and I saw the list, and I was like, yeah, this guy's got a lot of stuff. I'll go with that. So I chose Elijah. But I didn't really realize how much, so I'm starting to make it. I'm like, I thought this would be easy. It turns out not as easy as I thought. So I learned a lot, which especially with a popular character in the Bible, sometimes you think like, I know everything there is to know about this. And then you read every word of the chapters that they're in, and you're like, oh no, there's way, way more to this. So I really appreciate Scott giving me the opportunity, if it's just for myself, to learn more about Elijah here. I did want this podium. I try not to. I don't know. I'm kind of a mover. I'm also like, this podium's almost as tall as I am, so I'll have to move in and out here. So the first thing is I wanted to ask. I see this online all the time, like screen time and popularity. So like, if you think about a movie or a book or something that is a very small character, but it's the one that stands out, right? When you think of this movie, this is what you think of. So a big one I thought of was like Darth Vader, right? You think of Star Wars, first thing that comes to mind is Darth Vader. He's in that movie for 8 minutes, right? Another one The Wicked Witch, I didn't realize this, is only in The Wizard of Oz for 12 minutes. Godzilla, the name of the movie is Godzilla. In it for 7.5 minutes of the Godzilla movie. But the one that I chose, when I thought of this, like what is something, if I think of a movie, I think of a character, but they're not really in it. It was in The Incredibles, the Edna character, the real short with the bobby hair. She's in it for like 3.5 minutes. But when I think of that, does anybody have one of those? First time I taught this class, I got a couple of good ones. Anybody? No? That's how this class is going to go. I get it. All right. I had to know. So in a book series I've been reading, Jaws. Yeah, great. The shark's only in it for you see the actual shark for probably just like seconds, right? It's not in it, not in it for very long. Yeah, and it's called Jaws. There's a book series that I like. There's a character. Her name is Lift. She's like this little girl, but she has all the powers of the adults. And the way she gets her powers is she eats pancakes. In this very serious, epic fantasy, you have this like 10-year-old child that just runs around and and steals people's breakfast, and that's how she gets her stuff. So I thought about this because I thought this was kind of interesting, because when we think about Elijah in the Old Testament, this is kind of how he is. But in the New Testament, he's mentioned a lot. So Elijah only appears in 1 Kings 17 through 19. He's then gone in chapter 20. He's back in 21 and in 2 Kings 1 and 2. So if my count is right, that is only 6 chapters in the entire Old Testament. All right? 6 chapters in the entire Old Testament. In the New Testament, however, he is the second most mentioned prophet. Who is the first? Who said it? Someone said it. Say it louder. Isaiah, yeah. So Isaiah is mentioned or quoted, I think, around 65 times. And Elijah is mentioned 29 times. And I find that very interesting. For somebody who had really, he doesn't have a book named after him. He's only in, like I said, 6 chapters. Like, he is only physically in 6 chapters in the whole Bible, and yet made an enormous impact. Well, yeah, I was going to get to that. So there you go. Yeah. So, Yeah, made an enormous impact. Exactly. So that's kind of how it is. Because I would imagine if before this class, if somebody would say, hey, name an Old Testament prophet, Isaiah would be the first one to come up, and Elijah would probably follow very close behind. And I think a lot of that has to do with how often he's mentioned in the New Testament. What I thought, too, was interesting is Daniel has an entire book. He's mentioned 5 times in the New Testament, and Jeremiah, who was a pretty big deal, is also only mentioned 3 times. And so, there you go. As was mentioned, he is mentioned in the Transfiguration in Matthew 17, 1 through 8, and the times that Jesus goes up on the mountain. He's there with Moses and Elijah. And I guess just before we get into his life and his character, why do you think... So Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. He set the law for the Jewish people. Why do you think that Elijah was also there for somebody who made 2 prophecies? He did a bunch of cool stuff. He's like the Captain America of the Old Testament. We'll get into why that is. But why do you think Elijah would have been present for Jesus? I think that's pretty much spot on. That's maybe the biggest reason, yeah. He was somebody who God revered so well that he didn't even let him die, right? Any other reasons that come off the top of your head? Yeah. He did raise someone from the dead. I don't know if he was the first. I should know that. I'm doing this today, but I think that you might be right about that. Yes, but he did. That was one of his first miracles, was raising someone from the dead. So he has that in common with Jesus' ministry. So that sort of validates a lot of what Jesus did with Lazarus and then also himself. I should have actually known that. That was no. You're good. He probably was, but yeah, So the miracles that he placed were very similar to what Jesus did, yeah, good. Anything else? Any other reasons why you think? Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So he was somebody who was so faithful, right, that God not only blessed him to go to heaven without dying and getting to just meet the Creator, but he also, in that, the way, however it works, right, was then able to come back and sort of be there for a blessing for Jesus as well. All right, so... however, when you think about, and there was another slide here, I didn't mean to, I deleted it on accident. When you think about this time period, we don't often have a villain in these stories. I talk a lot about how I really like the story of Esther, because you get this really cool character arc. And there is a villain in that story, although in that story the villain is more of like a henchman, right? But in this story, when you think about Elijah and the adversary, right? So Elijah, if he's our hero and he's our protagonist, who is our antagonist? Jezebel, right? Because when we think of evil people in the Bible, I know one of the things that came to my mind immediately was Jezebel. And this person has made a lot of impact in just regular, everyday vernacular, right? You hear people in secular conversations will call somebody a Jezebel. Have you ever heard that before? right? So they'll call them, they'll call somebody that. So she is very, very, very widely known, even really with outside of Christian circles, as a bad guy, a big villain. However, her husband, Ahab, who obviously, if you think of evil people in the Bible, maybe some people's mind went to that, right? He was considered to be the most evil of kings. And part of that probably comes along with the fact that evil people choose bad people to be around, right? Now, she was the daughter of Ethbal, who was the king of the Sidonians, and she was one of the main persecutor of the Hebrew prophets. So when she became queen, one of the very first things that she did was have the prophets of Israel murdered, or most of them. Anyone that didn't want to be a part of their governing body, right, was just done away with. And the big reason for that is because the main god for the Sidonians, does anybody know who the main god was? Baal. Exactly. So one of the reasons why she was likely the reason why at the time of Ahab, when he was resurrecting the idols, Baal was the main central god. That was like a gift he was giving to his wife to also allow her religion to flourish at the time. But he didn't just raise statues and idols for Baal. He was the only king of Israel to also recognize what other god along with Baal. Does anybody know? Asherah, which is Baal's wife, right? So that was also like Ahab and Jezebel, and you had Baal and Asherah. So he actually was one of, not the only king, to raise up statues and idols for not only Baal, who, there's different iterations of Baal throughout the Old Testament, but not only Baal, but also Baal's wife Asherah, which again would have been a gift to his wife, who her whole goal was just take over the power, any power that she wanted, and like I said, in one of her first orders, just basically say, hey, we've got all of these prophets to God. They follow this Levitical law. We got to get this out of here, and if you don't want to listen to us, you're done with it, right? So because of all of this, Ahab really, he set his mind on conquering land and giving praise against God. And does that normally go pretty well for the Israelites? No, not really. So, God at this time, we've gone through the judges. That didn't really work, right? The people wanted the kings, right? And we had a couple that are doing okay. You've got a few in Judah that do fine. But how many kings of Israel followed God? How many kings of Israel after David and Solomon followed God? None, right? So Israel is constantly having this battle within itself of, I see a prophet, I hear what he's got to say, maybe I'll do it. No, forget it, right? So God needed somebody to come and finally give a real prophecy and sort of try and wake these people up, right? And who does he send? He sent Elijah, who is just a Tishbite. So in 1 Kings 17, 1 through 7, says, Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. And the word of the Lord came to him, Depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens feed you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening. And he drank from the brook. And after a while, the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. So, Elijah, I find it interesting. He sort of comes out of nowhere, right? There isn't this whole paragraph of where this guy came from. So it says, I looked it up because I was like, what is a Tishbite? Does anybody know what that is? What is a Tishbite? They're basically just nomads. So they believe that he came out of Gilead. It says that he's a Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead, right? If they weren't, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where he was from. Now, he might have been born there, who knows? But he was of some kind of line of nomads that were sort of coming around. So he almost literally just sort of comes out of nowhere for all of these people, right? And again, with no context, this guy just goes up and says to the king that we already know at this point is pretty evil, right? And his dad wasn't any better. The very first thing that he does is says, As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there will be neither dew nor rain in these years except by my word. He says there's going to be a drought. Basically, if you don't turn back to God, there is going to be a drought indefinitely. So that obviously makes Ahab really happy, right? And God tells Elijah to skedat. You got to go. Because this prophecy is going to come true, right? He goes up to Ahab. There's going to be no rain. There's no dew. Everything's going to dry up. And Ahab probably just immediately believed this guy, right? Like, oh yeah, crazy person. No, he probably was like, whatever, this guy, he doesn't know. How does he know there's going to be no rain? But God sent him out because like, hey, this is going to happen. And it did. And one of the interesting things that he fed himself by God sending ravens to bring him food and water. Almost commanding animals to make it to where he doesn't have to leave during this time period. Which I find very, very interesting. So he escaped to that cave. So he performs his very first miracle with flour and oil. So will somebody read for me, same chapter, 1 Kings 17, verses 12 through 16. Thank you. So this is his first miracle. So he goes and he's called out of the cave, and he meets with a woman in Zarephath, and he says to her, "Bake me some bread." And she's like, "We only have this much." And he says, "If you make me the last of this bread and allow for me to eat, then you will never run out of this oil. It will be infinite oil, right? Infinite resource," which goes along with, very similarly to other miracles that we learn about, like what miracle did Jesus perform in which food did not run out? Right, yeah. And it's interesting too, because in my mind I think about how, like, if you play like a video game and there's like a basket of something and people are constantly taking it, it seems like it's never ending. It's like Mary Poppins for other people who don't get that reference, right? Just constantly pulling it out of the bag, right? Kind of how I think of the feeding of the 5,000. Like, they've got a little bit of fish. Every time they take a fish, there's just another fish that just is underneath it somehow, right? Very similar to this. So another parallel to Jesus is these miracles that he's performing, pretty similar, right? So somebody read for me. Yeah, go ahead. Sure. Yeah. Right. I'm going to make this for this man. I have no idea if what he's saying is even true. I'm going to do it anyway. That's servant attitude. Getting, and on that note, again, if we read verses 21 through 24 for me. All right, thank you. All right, so to follow up on what you said, which I think is important, right? So we have this woman who has a lot of faith, right? She gives him this bread, and then the first miracle becomes true. Then her son gets sick, and Elijah says to God, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow whom I sojourned by killing her son?" So both of these people have an extreme amount of faith at this point, correct? Would you say? And then this happens. Why in this? Because we're about to get into the bigger, more grander scale of this. Why in this large, epic story are we learning about these little, minuscule things? What is the point of this chapter? Yeah. Agreed. Because Elijah, although called out to God, believed that he could do this, right? Very similar. She believed that he would grant her this oil, right? So this is all setting up toward God needs to know whether or not this person is actually going to follow through with the next stage of what he needs him to do, right? I've always, anytime we study Exodus, I always get into the fact that, like, if you look at the plagues, yes, that was basically a way to take small jabs at the Pharaoh to break his heart up. But in each time, it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. He knew it was going to happen. It was just as much a test for Moses to say, hey, you're going to do this. You are the guy. And I think there are times in the Old Testament, in the New Testament even, that God puts tests on his people, right? To make sure, yes, this is the right person, but to instill that faith in them, right? How often in our lives, if we can just do one task, get the task done, right, then we can do something grander, something bigger. He follows up with these, small miracle of, I'm just going to create infinite oil and bread. I mean, that's a huge deal. I mean, I'd be freaking out if that happened to me. But it's not as grand of scale as raising someone from the dead or preventing him from dying, whichever the two. So now Elijah knows that he can do anything that God wants him to do. So when we talk about our theme, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, this is Elijah putting his mind to the test for God, right? All right. Next up is 1 Kings 18. And honestly, if I had to have maybe a favorite chapter in the Bible, this is going to be right there in the top of the line. Because honestly, I think, we read the Bible and we want to study it, we really want to digest it, but sometimes you read a chapter and you're just like, this is kind of fun to read. This is actually just kind of awesome. There is an epic nature about this that I find not only interesting and is strengthening my faith, but to be honest, I'm just sort of enjoying myself. I feel like if I was reading just a fictional novel, this could be a pretty awesome climax to it, and it really happened in real life, right? I mean, that's just the way I look at it. And I think that this chapter is one of those times that we hit one of those peaks where we have this great story that strengthens our faith. It's also just kind of fun to read, right? So after he leaves, all right, he meets up with Obadiah, okay? And Obadiah is one of these prophets that was not killed by Jezebel, but works as an assistant with Ahab. And in times, we think Obadiah, maybe this guy, a little sleazy, obviously if he didn't get killed, he's no good. No, Obadiah has taken some of these prophets as refuge and fed them, right? So he knows Elijah. He knows about what he means. And he also knows that Ahab kind of hates this guy, right? Last time he saw him, there was this massive drought, and they have not had water for a long, long time. It's been over 2 years at this point. So Ahab has accused Elijah of the drought. And again, in the chapter before, we see Elijah just kind of walks up to this guy and says this to him, or at least in some way does this, right? The only context that we have is that he said it to him. And here, he basically looks at Obadiah and says, you have to be the one to get me in front of the king. Obadiah's like, man, if I do that, you're not going to die. I'm going to die. But he does it. So he goes to him not once, not twice, but 3 times. He finally says, you got to get me in front of the king. Obadiah, just like some of the other people that have been here, has faith in Elijah, like, okay, you're telling me I'm going to be okay? So he gets him in front of Ahab. And in verse 17 through 19, in chapter 18, it says, when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, is it you troubler of Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you have and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So he goes up to Ahab and he's like, you know what, man? Here's what we're going to do. You don't believe me. You don't believe when I tell you that this drought will end if you just trust in me. So, how about a little context? How about you take all 450 of the prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, just for fun, why not? And we're going to set up on the top of a mountain 2 altars. And whichever God can set ablaze this altar first wins. Right? Pretty cool if it works. So they do it. And I got to tell you, again, like I said, they're going through, they're calling upon Baal's name. It says, in verse 23, it says, let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it into pieces, and lay it on wood, and put no fire to it. And we'll prepare the other bull, and lay it on the fire, put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I'll call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. And they took the bull that was given to us, and they said, oh, Baal, answer us. But there was no voice. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And I got to tell you, again, sometimes you read a verse and you just have a little laugh to yourself. This time I laughed out loud because in verse 27, we get some character moment here. At noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he is God. He is either musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey. Perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened. So, I just picture Elijah's sitting up on his altar, and he's like, you know what? Maybe your God went to the bathroom. That's all I can think of when I'm reading this, right? We don't really get that often. But he's literally sitting there amongst 800 people. And you got to imagine, even if Elijah was really built, 800 people, you're not going to stand a chance if they get mad and want to rush you, And he's just mocking. And like I said, when I read that the first time, I just laughed out loud. Because I'm like, this is not just this interesting thing that is happening that is pretty cool and shows God's power, but, Elijah, he's got a little bit of character to it. Okay? All right. I'm going to read for me verses 31 through 35. 31 through 35. 1 Kings 18, 31 through 35. All right, so prophets of Baal got it up there, calling to God. Nothing's happening, joking around. Maybe your God's gone out to lunch. He says, hey, why don't you fill up mine with a moat and pour water on it? And again, why don't you do it again? How about a third time? Just dump water on this thing. And in verse 37, answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. And all of the people saw it and fell on their faces and said, "The Lord is God, the Lord is God." And Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, let not one escape." And they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. So the big question is, was this spectacle necessary? Why? Yeah, I think the spectacle is really for the people, right? To show that even if your king is propping up a false god, this is the power that we have, right? And it's not me that's doing this. He gives, later in the chapter, he gives no credit to himself. This is God that is performing this. So we have these each progressively bigger miracles to prove to Elijah and to show to the other people. Again, he's committing his soul to God, right? Using his mind and his soul. Yes. Yep. Yeah. That is part of, obviously, too, of the point. He knew. He sat there mocking these people because he knew this is going to happen. Yeah. Yes. When you have so much evil, sometimes it has to be countered with so much good. I agree with that. All right, so rain then comes to the land because Ahab basically says, "Okay, you win." But that really doesn't make his wife too happy. So she threatens Elijah, and he has to get out of Dodge again. He escapes to Mount Horeb, which is also Mount. Anybody know? Sinai. Yeah, there you go. So he escapes to Mount Sinai. That was a pretty big deal mountain, I think, at some point. Right? Yeah. So, yep. It is here that God gives Elijah the tasks of anointing the kings to end the idol worship. So now it gets to the point of, who is this guy and why is he so special? So he is here on Mount Horeb, hiding, right, for his life again. And this is where God says, you have proven yourself. It is time, basically it's time for you to be the one to put an end to these kings that worship Baal, put an end to the idol worship. Out of time a little bit. All right, so But he needs a helper, so he finds Elisha, and he brings him his cloak. And the one that I put my cloak on will be my follower. And he puts his cloak on Elisha. So then chapter 21. Sorry. We're just kind of running out of time. Sorry. So we go through. Ahab wins some more battles. Basically, chapter 20 is just Ahab sort of forgetting everything that happened in the past. He conquers a little bit more land, right? Sort of reverts back, kind of starting to revert back to who he was. Okay, so he then is speaking with his wife, and she says, "I want to give you this vineyard. This guy over here, his name is Naboth. He owns this vineyard. I'm gonna convince him to give it to you for your birthday or for a celebration of this big win." And she has this man killed, and he takes the vineyard. And Elijah shows back up and says, "Your wife didn't obtain this; she had this man killed." And Ahab, again, believes it because of all the things that Elijah has said to him has come true, and he has her put to death. All right? So he is humbled. He is humbled in this very moment. However, he doesn't make it. He's killed in battle, and his son takes over. All right? And his son is Ahaziah. So, new king, but same Elijah, right? So Ahab is killed in a battle with Jehoshaphat, who had his own prophet at the time. And Ahaziah had only been king for 2 years. And he falls out of a window, which is exactly the way they threw Jezebel out of a window, right? And in verses 13 through 17, 21. Shoot. Yep. No, sorry. I had this written down wrong. Well, so Ahaziah knows who Elijah is, right? From the look of him. Oh, sorry, verse 6. Sorry, verse 6. In verse 6, he says to him in 2 Kings 1, in verse 6, the messengers returned to the king and said, "Why have you returned?" They said to him, "There came a man to meet with us and said, 'Go back to the king who sent you. Thus says the Lord, it is because there is no God in Israel that you are sending to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. Therefore you should not come down, or you will surely die.'" And he says, "What kind of man was it to meet you?" And they said, "He wore a garment of hair, a belt of leather around his waist." And he said, "Elijah the Tishbite." All they got to do is describe this guy, and he knows who it is. So he goes to Ahab and says, "You will not have any descendants from your heir because you reject God." And Ahab falls out of a window, and he gets sick and dies. But the interesting part about Elijah, I'll end with this, is Elijah doesn't get to fulfill his prophecy. Elisha gets to do that. And the reason for that is God believed in Elijah's work so much that these other prophets that were going to follow him, these 40 other prophets, he let him ascend into heaven and let these 40 do his work. So it wasn't just of one man. It was, again, him loving God with his heart, soul, and mind, and being able to spread that out. and they were the first prophets to have the idols of Baal taken down in Israel over the course of 3 kings. So that's Elijah.